3, 2, 1, and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery with the Hubble Space Telescope, our window on the universe.
Mission Control, Houston.
We choose to go to the moon.
Launching of the Russian satellite.
The world's greatest spacefaring nation.
Such weapons humanity will be unable to endure.
All program.
There are 72 countries with space programs and dozens of major players in the private sector. As we transition from the age of discovery to security and commerce, what legal frameworks, investments, and partnerships are needed to maintain a rules-based international order beyond the boundaries of nations? This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, shaping the future of outer space.
It is a pleasure to introduce our panelists today. First of all, we have Therese Jones, and she is Senior Director of Policy at the Satellite Industry Association. We also have Scott Pace. He is the Director of the Space Policy Institute and Professor of the Practice of International Affairs at George Washington University. And next we have Dr. Jessica West, and she is a Senior Researcher at Ploughshares. So welcome to the three of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Space has been in the news for everyone this summer for many reasons that we'll get into later on, but I know that there have also been a lot of developments on your front as well. And in doing research for this program, I was actually shocked to learn about some of the statistics in terms of activity in space. And so I think that everyone who's listening will hopefully come away with some new information. So we wanted to start just laying the groundwork a little bit. More than 30 spacefaring nations have emerged in recent years, and 84 countries currently operate satellites above Earth. So there's this whole explosion of space actors that are shifting this dynamic of astropolitics. So Scott, turning to you, who is leading, and I don't even know if we use this term anymore, the space race today, and who are the major players on the horizon, both in terms of governments, but also commercial actors as well. So how would you describe that breakdown between military and commercial applications in space?
Well, sure. I think the first thing I'd say is we've often said is space is characterized by increasing democratization and globalization. Globalization in terms of more and more countries involved in space. The UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space is now up to 100 members. And I assure you they are not all there because they watch Star Trek. They're there because they see practical benefits from operating in space and geopolitical concerns with space. So it's an important place. So it's one of the largest UN technical committees. We're also seeing increased democratization. More and more private sector entities and even NGOs and universities are capable of going into space and operating there. So it's not something the province of governments alone anymore. So those are sort of the two really big trends. Now, space is a lot of space technologies are dual use, meaning they have both military and civil applications, not just rockets, but also things like remote sensing, satellite navigation, communications, even environmental monitoring can have dual use applications. So what we do in one sector kind of bleeds over into another. If you look at who sort of the major space powers are, essentially it's the ISS partners plus China, with a really an uncertain future with Russia. So you have some new players like the United Arab Emirates, for example, who is becoming more active. You have regional developments in Latin America becoming stronger. And you see, of course, a growing South Korean space development. But primarily it's the space station partners and China and Russia. Now, of course, Russia has been a partner with us on the station since the end of the Cold War. But that seems to be changing. And it's changing not only because geopolitics is a bit different, but also because their own capabilities are questionable. We've had a number of problems aboard the station, arguably from aging hardware, but the Russians are certainly very, very sophisticated. They have a lot of operational experience on a one-to-one basis. They're great to work with, but the geopolitical relationship is bad, and their own economy has not been doing well, and their space capabilities are increasingly in trouble. In contrast, the Chinese are growing, have been growing, demonstrating more and more new capabilities all the time. And there, the geopolitics, of course, is bad and getting worse. But space may or may not be another area of confrontation. They're doing a number of things that are very worrisome. And on the other hand, they've been doing things that are not worrisome and which are impressive. Their space station, I think they had the first female EVA spacewalk for them. They're looking at lunar plans. So there are a number of areas where we have the potential to maybe do cooperation with China, but again, it's against a backdrop of worsening geopolitical relations and increasing military concerns, not just in space, but also from their nuclear and conventional forces.
All right, great. Thank you very much. That's a very helpful introduction to the lay of the land. One other topic that has been on a lot of people's minds recently has been the environment, because we have a lot of world leaders meeting in Glasgow. So this idea of sustainability is very much in the air. So switching that to space, applying that to space. Jessica, there was a letter that you helped draft, an Outer Space Institute letter, urging the UN General Assembly to consider a treaty banning anti-satellite tests. And you cited a statistic that surprised me, which was that the number of active and defunct satellites in orbit has grown from 3,300 to over 7,600 in the last decade, with the potential of as many as 100,000 active satellites within the next 10 years, which to me just seems, what an incredible leap. So can you elaborate on why this is a growing problem and what kinds of issues we're looking at down the road if a sound policy isn't implemented?
Yes, absolutely. Let me first speak really briefly to the letter, because you led with that. And I'll just point out to the audience that this is a letter that is currently open for signature by anyone, including people watching today. It's online and you can check it out and add your name if you're interested. The focus of this initiative is really to promote an international ban on kinetic anti-satellite testing. Kinetic weapons use hardware such as missiles to hit and destroy objects in space, which creates debris that spreads out from the impact and pollutes the surrounding environment. So the idea of banning this kind of activity sits at that intersection of space security and arms control issues on the one hand, and what we're going to talk about now, space sustainability. The reason why people believe the ban is becoming so urgent today is really driven by the safety and environmental concern. Because as you pointed out, there's been a huge increase in the number of satellites operating in space, particularly in the orbits closest to Earth. And it's only predicted to continue to increase at an even faster pace. The numbers really are mind-boggling. I remember when I first started working on space issues and tracking the number of satellites in orbit, and I think there were just over 1,000. And then it was mind-boggling to think about there being maybe 4,000, a four-fold increase. And now we're talking about tens of increases and even 100-fold increase in just a few decades. And this heavy use of space brings a lot of benefits. We're creating many new capability and services that are available to people all around the world, things like space-based internet. But it brings challenges, and debris is a big one, and that's the focus of the international letter. Unless intentionally deorbited, objects that we place in space stay there. And so you can imagine having car accidents on a really busy highway and not having a way to clear up the mess and the kind of problems that creates for safety and sustainability. The science behind this letter indicates that low Earth orbit will become so busy that even a single piece of unnecessary debris that is created by an action such as a weapons test is just one too many. Speaking of car accidents, the potential for accidental collision between satellites is another concern that's getting greater attention and spurring calls for more rules and better management of space traffic so that we don't have accidental collisions. But it's not just debris. Light pollution is another challenge. Satellites are very bright, and we have thousands of more of them whizzing above us in the sky at night. And so this makes it difficult for regular people like you and I to see the night sky. It can have impacts on traditional knowledge and practices, and it makes it really difficult for astronomers to do their work when the view of outer space is increasingly obstructed. And finally, what goes up must come down. You know, satellites are composed of metal and batteries and chemical components, and most of them burn up in the atmosphere when they re-enter, but not all of them. And we really don't know what the impact of having so many more satellites re-entering each year might have on the environment. All of this isn't to say that our growing use of space is bad. It's good, and we're gaining tremendous benefit. But it points to the fact that it introduces other problems that we have to work out. Some of these have technical solutions, and others are a bit deeper, and they involve competing values and competing uses of space. And it means that we have to try to find ways to accommodate these kinds of conflicts and figure out how to do good in the long term for as many people as possible.
Wonderful, thank you. Therese, continuing on this idea of sustainability, I think you've had the chance to look at this topic from a variety of perspectives. So how central do you think the concept of space sustainability is in terms of its being embedded in current space activities? And what actions by the private sector or governments can be taken to catch up with what you would consider to be acceptable standards? And kind of tacking on to that, what do you see the role of the private sector as being in terms of supporting sustainable space activities?
Thanks, that's a great question. So at SIA, we represent over 50 different space companies. So satellite companies, launch companies, ground equipment providers, and all of them see space sustainability as really critical to their business case. They recognize that if they pollute the space environment right now, they won't have business, a decade in the future, including the geo operators who have to launch satellites through this more congested low Earth orbit environment. So we've had a number of different working groups on these space sustainability issues, coming up with things like industry-led best practices on space sustainability that are meant to, be a model for industry internationally, that talk about things like minimizing the creation of debris, both on launch and in on-orbit operations, talking about the importance of timely communication with other operators to deconflict potential conjunctions, trying to deorbit or move your satellites into a graveyard orbit as quickly as possible. So there's a lot of discussion on this from an industry standpoint in terms of best practices, but we've also really closely been working with the government on this issue. So the Space Council and in the Department of Commerce, there's an Office of Space Commerce that's working on what they call an open architecture data repository, which is seeking to move the function of tracking space debris has traditionally been within the DoD. And there's a movement within the US government to move this effort over into the Department of Commerce, because right now, for the first time ever this past year, we had more commercial satellites on orbit than government ones. And that fraction is just going to continue to increase. So we really want commercial actors to be able to input data into this architecture, not just from the US, but for it to be internationally acceptable. And then also, cooperate across governments to make space data more reliable and accessible. A number of our operators are working with, it's called the 18th Space Control Squadron, on modeling the effect of their proposed constellations and trying to minimize debris creation that way. And I should say companies, not only are launching satellites and they're trying to plan debris mitigation, but they're also working on new and innovative technologies, such as being able to do automated maneuvers of their satellites if they can get a conjunction warning. They're also working on technologies like active debris removal, so being able to, attach, a grappling hook to a satellite on orbit and be able to maneuver it, or other such capture technologies to mitigate this. But the piece that's really the most difficult one, I think, is the international geopolitical one. Already talked a little bit about Russia and China, but on an international stage, there are a number of countries, including Russia and China, that really think it should only be state-to-state diplomacy on these issues. And that's ignoring this really big commercial sector that's booming right now. And if we only have state-to-state cooperation on these issues, I think we're going to run into a lot of future problems on orbital debris.
Interesting. Thank you, Therese. And that leads us nicely into just sort of back into where Network 2020 likes to often talk about, which is on the foreign policy side of things, and on the geopolitics of everything. So, Scott, turning back to you and kind of picking up on a thread that we were talking about before, in terms of what's happening in space, reflecting some of what's happening on Earth. China has rapidly expanded its presence in outer space with in both the civil and military areas. So what do you see driving China's space ambitions? And maybe you can even elaborate on Therese's point earlier, where they saw only government-to-government collaboration or diplomacy on some policies. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that and what we can expect for them in years or so.
Well, to first order, I mean, China is doing things in space for their own national interest for a number of perfectly understandable reasons. They see it as increasing the prestige of the Chinese Communist Party. It's part of Xi Jinping's desire to, grow the power and visibility of the Chinese of China. They use it to encourage younger people to go into math and science and STEM education. They use it to increase the quality of their supply chains because to build things to quality levels for spacecraft is demanding, and so it helps there. It teaches system engineering skills that, of course, have dual use benefits for weapon systems. It gives them a diplomatic option to use with other countries. So if they're looking at resources, say, from overseas, they can offer space technology as part of that kind of trade. So there's a whole range of perfectly understandable reasons why they would want to have space capabilities. And I would distinguish between some things that are probably very much at the prestige end of things, like some of the lunar landers and space stations and so forth, where they are looking to do things that other people have not done. They're not looking at doing things that are just repeating what had been going on 50 years before. For example, their lunar lander that went to the far side of the moon, something that we hadn't done. We were capable of doing it. We just didn't do it. They did. They're looking to find areas that are unique that they can, kind of claim for themselves, again, which is understandable. And those don't by themselves cause me a lot of concern. I've actually found in discussion of space resources, for example, the Chinese to be very pragmatic and in many ways aligned with some of our thinking on use and utilization of resources in space and what we'd have to do that safely. So it's not necessarily an area of conflict. On the other hand, their behavior in other domains, cyberspace, South China Sea, potentially even the Arctic regions and Antarctic regions, make it very clear that if they see their national interests threatened, they don't really care what anybody thinks. And so that's a problem. I think that if we look at the structures that we can, areas of commonality going forward, noting Jessica's point about the letter that was done, a way to start is to simply not continue to do things that people found objectionable, like blowing up satellites and causing lots of debris. After a lot of international criticism, the Chinese haven't done that again. After some criticism, I hope the Indians won't do that again. And so simply a test ban moratorium can be something that states can do now, which is the same thing that happened with atmospheric nuclear weapons tests. We didn't have a test ban treaty. We started with a simply unilateral moratorium statements that states can do on their own. With regard to the commercial sectors being involved, there are a number of areas where I think we have some profound disagreements internationally, not with China actually as much with other states, including some in Europe and Russia. Parts of the UN are very uncomfortable with the idea of private sector participation. We, of course, are very comfortable with it. And yet, if you look at the space debris area, the most promising area, I think, for mitigating or even reducing this hazard is going to be operator to operator agreements, which has already been done in GEO. We need to do more of that in LEO. It is not going to be governments that are going to be able to do this. In fact, government tracking capabilities that are publicly releasable, in fact, are largely inadequate to mitigate and do the kind of debris management that needs to be done. And it's going to be operator to operator arrangements by the private sector that are largely going to do that, which in turn is in line with the U.S. approach and many of our friends and allies of a bottom-up approach to dealing with new rules and behavior in space. That is, you look at best practices or things that ought to be done technically without a lot of political spin to them, and you try to codify them, which is what we did with the long-term sustainability of space activities, and which we are still now in discussion with for things like rendezvous and proximity operations. What we don't try to do is convene a bunch of lawyers and impose a top-down approach, which tends to be slow, tends to be rigid, tends not to be based on what people can practically do. One of the things that's been hopeful in recent years is people are more willing to look at, including, I hope, Russia and other countries, been more willing to look at behavioral-based limitations like don't blow things up, as opposed to things like bans against placement of weapons in space or preventing an arms race in space, which the U.S. has usually found to be fundamentally flawed because no one can tell you what a weapon is in a way that makes any logical sense. So banning things that are subject to debate and hard to verify is a more difficult path than banning actions, which are easier to verify. And of course, is the subject of a letter that Jessica mentioned. So operator-to-operator arrangements by the private sector, bottom-up versus top-down kind of things, being behavioral-based, having a broader diversity of information running around through the OADR versus a centralized transnational or transgovernmental organization. These are kind of like the splitting points that you can find people on different sides. So everybody agrees with sustainability of space and needs to be preserved and not do anything dumb. But there are several different approaches that people take. And I'm hoping that our approach, the US approach, is slowly winning over converts.
Thank you, Scott. Following on that, Jessica, turning to you, can you elaborate on the importance of soft law and non-binding norms in current space law? So again, sort of like what Scott was saying about, hopefully other players joining in, but what are some of the non-binding norms, and is this enough? Or do you see the need for more enforceable policy in the long or even the short term?
Yeah, so Scott's given us a really great rundown of the way norms work. They tend to be bottom up, best practices, focused on behavior. They're things that we do because we ought to, not because they're legally required or because we know we're expected to do them. And I like to use examples like taking your shoes off in people's homes. These are norms. Giving up your seat to certain groups of people on the bus. These are all sort of social norms that we use to get along on a day-to-day basis when we're interacting with other people, and that same logic can apply at the international level to governance. And when it comes to norms, Therese is bang on. Industry leads on this. They have really spearheaded this development of industry-led best practices, and it's a model I think that can apply to other challenges of space governance, including, say, military activities in space. And there's a really great new development last week at the United Nations. The United Kingdom has been leading an initiative to try to address the underlying arms race that Scott alluded to in space from a behavioral approach and kind of from a voluntary approach, if you will. And so they've been arguing and trying to get states to get behind the idea of agreeing to norms of behavior in space, sort of like what Therese was talking about, military best practices, if you will, in an effort to avoid unintentional conflict. So not doing things that make other states worried and react in an aggressive way where you find yourself in an escalating conflict, and not to do things that might be dangerous and harmful to other operators if that's not your intention. And I think 165 states last week at the first committee of the United Nations in New York, where you are, voted in favor of creating a working group to start developing what these behaviors might be from a bottom-up approach focused on practice. There were a few outliers. The no votes were Russia, China, Nicaragua, North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela. I think I hit all 8. But I think it's a huge success, and it's a big win, and it's building on a model that's been working elsewhere. We've also seen it on long-term sustainability. So we don't have laws against pollution in space per se. We have a commitment internationally not to contaminate the environment, but we've adopted voluntary rules related to debris mitigation that Scott pointed to, the long-term sustainability guidelines. And so it takes that idea and tries to move it forward in an arms control area. Is it enough? I mean, yes and no. Norms are really central to collective governance, and they're central to law. They often tell us how laws work in practice. And they're often the starting point for stronger measures of governance. So the United States has been a huge advocate and a leader of a normative behavior approach in space. I think earlier in our pre-chat, Scott called it the least bad and the easiest. They're kind of easy and they're kind of not. Are they enough depends on, are they followed? And that depends on content. Is the content adequate to deal with the problems that we have? And do we have enough agreement amongst players and commitment to adhere to the rules or not? And so that will impact whether or not they're sufficient. My own experience in arms control is that norms have been vital. We've started with norms in a lot of areas of arms control, norms of non-use of particular weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, landmines. And then over time, we found that we had to codify them into stronger agreements and build on some of the capabilities that Scott was talking to verify and to provide mutual assurances. So I see this as a huge win. But I also see it as the start of a long-term process and hopefully an ongoing international dialogue to try to build that joint commitment and to continue discussing these issues on a really practical level internationally.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jessica. So it sounds like there are a lot of positive developments in many senses in terms of what's happening internationally. Therese, turning to you on the commercial side of this sort of security dimension coin, where is the intersection of private industry and governments in the current situation? As we talked about, private industry operates a lot of satellites, more, I think, now than we were saying that governments operate. And they're really critical to our daily life and our ability to function as societies. I don't even want to think about how dependent I am probably on satellite technology. So what is the interplay between those industry players and governments in our own security?
Great question. So there are a number of security issues that impact commercial operators. Already touched a bit on the anti-satellite tests, but India blew up a satellite a few years ago, and they claimed it was a low enough orbit to deorbit the debris quickly. But actually, a number of our operators had conjunction warnings with debris from that test, and so that's an issue that's not only security related and geopolitical, but that really impacted the private sector. There are other issues like the inspection of satellites on orbit by other countries that have impacted commercial operators. And you never know, is it a space weapon? Are they just trying to get intelligence on the satellite? There aren't really norms around inspection of satellites in space that are well developed or that are consistently adhered to. And there's a lot of intellectual property theft from commercial actors as well. But cybersecurity is a really big issue. We have issues with potentially GPS being jammed or the signal being spoofed, so you're told that you're in a different location than you're in, and also jamming on the communications side as well. NIST, I think it was NIST, did a study a couple of years ago that said that the US would lose $1 billion per day if there were a GPS outage, because GPS hits on so many different sectors, including it's very heavily used in agriculture to help farmers plant their crops precisely. And the private sector impacts of a major attack could be very large. And I think partially thanks to Scott's work on the Space Council, there has been an increasing effort from the government, the US government, to include industry in these cybersecurity issues. Space Policy Directive 5 was focused on bringing in the commercial industry to work on space cybersecurity best practices, and the Department of Homeland Security, which works on this, has recently formed a space systems working group because they recognize it's really important to bring commercial actors in, since not just the US government, but the broader US economy is really reliant on space systems.
Well, unfortunately, we have to end there. But Scott, Jessica, Therese, thank you so much. This was a fascinating conversation, very outside my realm of normal conversation, but one, an area that is clearly growing in importance, and we'll just see that more and more, I think, as time goes on. So thank you so much for cluing us into what we should be paying attention to, and what to be looking for. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Global Insights. To learn more and to find out how you can become a member of Network 2020, visit us at network2020.org. We're taking a short break, but we'll be back to our regular publishing schedule shortly. See you again soon.